get started. Okay, so I'm going to jump right in and start talking about pollinators. And I want to start with the honeybee because unfortunately, that's what most people think about when they think about pollinators these days within the general public. And so I'll just make my standard case for the fact that honeybees are not really what we ought to be focusing on. They don't do the job that they need to do, or we need them to do for most wildflowers. You know, they're a livestock species that is useful for sure. And I like honey as much as everybody else. But when we think about bees and pollinators, I'm hoping that people will think about things like bumblebees, which in Nebraska, at least where I'm from, there's 20 different species. And then all the other small native bees that really play an important role. You know, there's probably 400 or 500 different native bees in Nebraska. We don't have a great inventory of those yet, but within North America, you know, you're up in that 4,000 to 5,000 species range of native bees, and they come in all different shapes and sizes and colors, and they play lots of different roles. Sometimes because they are different sizes and shapes where they can fit into a flower, for example, that another pollinator can't get to. Some have long tongues or short tongues. Some are more specialized on some species than others. It's just an incredible diversity of these little bees out there. Most of those are single moms, right? So they're not colonial. They don't have queens and workers like honeybees or some bumblebees or other more colonial species. The vast majority are solitary bees or something along those lines, where there's basically one female bee with a nest, usually a hole in the ground or in a hollow stem, collecting food both for herself and for the kids, and then trying to protect the nest when she's not doing all of that. And as I said, most of these bees, well, some of these bees are specialists, like this one here. This is the blue sage bee, which has a gorgeous blue eye that matches the flower that it specializes on to feed on. So as far as we know, this species only feeds on pitcher sage or blue sage here. It's a salvia, but that's pretty unusual. There are bees that might specialize on sunflowers, for example, but they can use a lot of different kinds of sunflowers. And then there are more bees that are, you know, more generalist than that. But the point is that because some of these are specialists, a lot of bees are only out for a particular part of the season, while others are out all season long. And regardless of whether they're there all season or for a short time, plant diversity is really important. And sometimes that's important because bee diversity responds to plant diversity because of specialization, where you have something like the blue sage bee or the little bee in the bottom right there, which is a specialist on penstemon plants. So you've got to have the right host plants, but also for any bee that's out for a length of time, it's unlikely that you're going to have one or two species of flowers that's going to be blooming for the entire time those bees are around. And so when one flower stops blooming, you've got to have others that start blooming to continue that cycle and the availability of flowers. So plant diversity relies on bees for sure, and pollinators in general, but also the reverse is true. And so when you have both of them together, we've got this kind of nice tight network. And this is true for not just bees, of course, but all kinds of other pollinators, whether that's flies or butterflies or moths or beetles or wasps. So that was kind of I wanted to throw that out at the beginning. And now I want to talk about sort of prairie ecology and management and relate that back to pollinators. I want to start with this idea because in a lot of prairies, the dominant vegetation tends to be grasses and a few of the more dominant forbs. And left unchecked, those species can really monopolize resources, both light above ground and then sort of moisture and nutrients below ground. And that means that new plants that are trying to come in and establish themselves have a really hard time because there's no room for them because you've got this sort of static and dominant plant community that's in place. And you can do some moderate defoliation of that or grazing, or you can, you know, mow it off or burn it off during the dormant season when nothing's growing. And that doesn't really have any impact necessarily on those plants because you're not really injuring those plants. You're not suppressing their vigor or affecting their growth much. But if you do some kind of severe defoliation, especially during the growing season when these plants are actively growing, you can really set them back in a way that slows the dominant plants down, especially the dominant grasses like big blue stem Indian grass, switchgrass, let alone the more invasive species like brome and fescue and Kentucky bluegrass. And here's what that can look like as an example. Here's a site that's been intensively grazed with cattle as part of a Patchburn Grazing system, which I'll talk about later. And the point is that, here these grasses are being grazed for an entire season, and that's going to take them a little while to recover from. And when that happens, that opens up a lot of space for other plants to come in, at least temporarily, while those grasses are being suppressed. So you've got light now above ground for germination, and you've got more space below ground because not all the big roots of those grasses are active and able to compete like they were before. Sometimes when that happens, you get sort of these big flushes of plants like Western ragweed, which are not fantastic for pollination, of course, although they are really valuable for some kinds of wildlife because of the seeds they produce. But a lot of times you get these flushes of opportunistic plants that include a lot of plants that are very valuable for pollinators. And these are things that a lot of people would look at and maybe call weedy plants. I call them opportunistic because weedy seems pretty subjective to me. And a lot of those, as the grasses will recover, and they will, as soon as that grazing leaves, those grasses begin recovering, but it takes them a while to do that. But once they do, most of those opportunistic plants kind of drop away again. They either become less active or they stop blooming, or they just disappear altogether, depending on the species. A few of them might persist and kind of add themselves to that diversity, at least for a little while. But unless there's some kind of repeat of that disturbance, a lot of those species just won't hang around in the system very well. Which all of that leads me to talk about weeds, because I think even as prairie folks, people who are botanists or big fans of prairies, we tend to have sort of these hierarchies of plant species in our minds a lot of times, with things like compass plant and lead plant and prairie clover at the top. And then things like this curly cup gumweed are kind of an afterthought, or even something that we sort of like, yeah, gumweed's everywhere, right? It's not a big deal. But a lot of these weedy species are really important for pollinators, and they also sort of add a lot to the ecosystem when they fill in when other things are gone. And we need them sometimes, right? When a drought hits, or when there's a disturbance of some kind to the prairie that either we weren't anticipating or we were doing for other reasons, these are the species that fill in the gaps and provide resources when other dominant plants that are usually there can't do their job. And I wanted to show you something with gumweed in particular. So this is curly cup gumweed. This is a species that's found across most of North America. It's an annual weed. This is a bunch of photos that I took within about an hour of sitting in one patch of gumweed one day, just because I was walking by and I noticed a lot of activity. And I thought, well, I wonder what's all here. And there was a lot more than this. These are just some of the photos I managed to capture of some of the pollinators that were visiting gumweed that day, in addition to some other species that were feeding on them and maybe being less effective as pollinators, but still, relying on those plants, and some predators who were taking advantage of the fact that all those other species were there. So there was this whole entire diverse community of invertebrates hanging around on this one patch of this weedy species that most people would dismiss as really unimportant. So I want to put this all now in the context of prairies and the disturbances and the systems that make prairies happen. So I want to talk a little bit about history. As long as today's prairies have been around in the central US, so from the end of the last ice age, as things started to warm up and dry out, and sort of the spruce forests and other communities like that started to give way to open habitats, one of the big reasons that happened was because of people on the landscape. So there have been people in this part of the world for as long as these prairies have existed. And one of the reasons those prairies formed in the first place and continue to exist as long as they did was the people that were there were using fire to manage them. So indigenous people's use of fire very intentionally and pretty frequently was a really important force in sort of moving the trees out of the way, preventing trees from coming back in. Drought, of course, was also important in that, especially in the further west you go, kind of the western prairies. Drought was probably more important than fire in terms of keeping woody vegetation out. And then bison and other large grazers, and small grazers for that matter, played an important role in this too. their role was more in terms of manipulating the plant community by changing what we just talked about, changing the competitive environment, but also changing habitat structure in a way that was really important for maintaining diversity of both plants and animals. But I think it's really important to remember here that all three of these forces were important, and that people have been an essential part of prairies since the beginning of these prairies, that these, the contemporary prairies that we have today for the last, say, 8 to 10,000 years. And I think that's important because people tend to look at nature, I think, especially in prairies in particular, and talk about, how do we get these prairies to the point where they don't need us or we can back off. And that's never really been what prairies are about. Prairies have always been connected to people and the management of people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's a great thing and something we should really be proud of, and then take on as kind of a role of being stewards of prairies. Okay, so I am somebody who uses grazing a lot in my prairies. I have prairies that work for that. They're big and they have the infrastructure to do it. I know a lot of people don't have that ability or aren't interested in grazing, and that's fine. I've seen some gorgeous prairies, lots of gorgeous prairies that don't have grazing on them. And you can maintain a really high diversity plant community without grazing, for sure. I think there are some species that you're missing when you do that, plant species, but you can have a lot of great plant communities without grazing. But one thing that gets really difficult if you're only using fire, as an example, as a management technique, is it's really hard to have the kind of habitat heterogeneity that drives species diversity, not just in plants, but especially in animals. And that species diversity that is facilitated by that heterogeneity is really what drives ecological resilience in prairies, which is something all of us should really, be caring about a lot. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Even though prairies are relatively flat and the vegetation is not sort of as complex as maybe a forest with a overstory, understory, shrub layer, herbaceous layer, leaf litter, all those sorts of things. There's a lot of diversity of habitat structure that you can find in a prairie. So you can have on one side, you can have this kind of tall, dense vegetation that's hard for us to even walk through. You can have something that's much more patchy, where there are patches of tall, patches of short, patches of bare ground, all sort of interspersed together. You can have areas that are uniformly short. You can have places like this photo I showed earlier, where there's kind of a combination of heights where the grasses maybe are short, but there's a lot of tall wildflowers or forbs scattered around in there. That can also look like this, sort of the same thing. And a lot of those habitats, especially those last couple, the more complex ones, it's really difficult to create that patchiness or that sort of mixture of structure without something like a large sentient animal who's grazing some plants and not others. And so I look at these large grazing animals, both cattle and bison, as sort of habitat artists, because they can do what is really difficult for us to do. So coming back to this photo one more time, how would you create that with fire? You really can't, because fire is not that selective. I guess if you were really artistic with a weed whacker and you had a lot of time on your hands, you could go out there and try to create this kind of structure, but that's a lot of work. Where this is something that just kind of comes naturally to cattle, and by altering, timing and frequency and intensity of grazing, you have a lot of flexibility on what that resulting structure can look like. So who cares, right? Why does all that habitat structure need? If we have the plant species diversity we like just by burning, why do we care about all the other things? Well, it matters because the animals care. So if you want both upland sandpipers and Henslow sparrows, as an example, in your prairie or in the landscape around your prairie, you've got to have the habitat types they need, and they need very different habitat structure. Same thing is true for a lot of invertebrates. Here's a couple different species that you would find in different parts of a prairie if in different kinds of habitat structure. And of course, we already talked about plants. So there's some that need a lot of light. They need to be sort of released from competition from the big dominant species. And then there are the big dominant species that do really well and thrive in a lack of disturbance, where maybe all they get is dormant season fire and they can just thrive every year and grow as big and strong as they want to. So if you want to have all of those species and not just a subsection of those, what we're really talking about here is there's a kind of an approach called the shifting mosaic of habitat, which is that you are going to provide patches of all those different vegetation structure types and sort of spread them across the landscape. And then you're going to move them around from year to year or from season to season. So if each of these was a different habitat structure, what you'd want in an ideal situation is for those to change in location over time, so that if you're a plant species and you can't move around very much, at least every several years, you're going to get the habitat structure that's ideal for you, right? Or the competitive environment, the growing conditions that are ideal. And in the years in between, you kind of hang on and wait for the good times to come back. And if you're an animal and fairly mobile, you can move around and you can follow your favorite habitat around the landscape within a reasonable distance, of course, so that you've always got kind of that optimal habitat, or at least good enough for you to survive and hopefully reproduce and be successful. And the combination of those two things kind of help facilitate and foster diversity in a really good way. So I want to share a couple of different possible approaches to creating that kind of shifting mosaic. And I'm presenting these not as something that I'm saying you should do this. I'm saying these are a couple of examples of what people have come up with to create a shifting mosaic. There are lots and lots of ways to do that. And anybody who has experience with cattle grazing or any kind of grazing, or even just prairies, and I'll talk about how to do this without grazing here a little bit too. Anybody who has that kind of creativity and time and experience can come up with their own ways of doing this, I think. But I just wanted to share these as examples. So patchburn grazing is an approach in which you take one large piece of prairie and you sort of burn a portion of it every year. And so you've got at any one time, you've got the most recent burn, you've got a burn from a previous year, and then you've got some areas that haven't been burned for a while. And you don't have to divide this into thirds. This is just an easy example. When you introduce grazers into that system, grazers are strongly attracted to recent burned areas. So this is one of the reasons that indigenous people used fire, was to burn out an area to attract bison so that they knew where they could hunt the next year, because they knew the bison would be concentrated in that area that they had burned. And those bison would camp out on that large area of burned area, and they would graze it pretty much all that season until something better came along, when there was a burn again somewhere else. And then the next year they would move into that new fresh burn. And in a patchburn grazing system, that same idea holds pretty well. And by the way, this is not true just in North America, right? You see the same thing in grasslands in Africa. This has been studied a lot with wildlife over there and how they respond to these kind of shifting patches of fire across the landscape. Anyway, but in a patchburn system, most of the grazing then in a particular year happens in that area that was most recently burned. Some of the cattle, if they run out of things to eat in the burned area, will bounce over into the previous year's burn. They might wander through the unburned area a little bit, but they're not really stopping to do a lot of grazing. And then when you burn another section the next year, the cattle sort of shift that grazing intensity over. So as a result, at any one time, you look across this prairie and you can find short cropped vegetation where, for example, an upland sandpiper might nest, where most of the grazing has been happening. You look at a year before that was burned, and you have that kind of weedy recovery transition period that is incredibly diverse for wildflowers and all these other opportunistic plants, which means you've got a lot of pollinator activity going on. There are a lot of bird species that use that either for nesting or for brood rearing. So things like an upland sandpiper or a prairie chicken or a bobwhite quail, for example, might nest in the tall vegetation or the short vegetation, but then they'll take their chicks as soon as they start moving around. They'll take them into that recovery transition area because they're short grass, which makes it easy to walk around, but there's overhead cover from those wildflowers and opportunistic plants. They just and tons of insects, because that's an ideal situation for grasshoppers and a lot of other insects those birds are eating. So having a combination really helps out some of those species that are looking for multiple types of habitat. And you've got the tall rank areas also for things like henslow sparrows that just need that kind of vegetation for nesting. So here are a couple of photos of a site along the Central Platte River in Nebraska where we've done patchburn grazing for quite a while and experimented with different ways of managing it. So this is a patch that was burned in the spring. This is a photo in July after the cattle had been out there grazing pretty hard. It started to get pretty dry toward the end of July. So a lot of those grasses like big blue stem not only got grazed for a long time, but also then got hit by the drought, and they just eventually gave up and said, okay, fine, we'll wait till next year and do this again. And then some of the plants that the cattle didn't choose, like some of these stiff sunflowers or the stiff goldenrod in the background, we're still providing, flowers and resources and a little bit of habitat structure. And I'm going to show you a photo of the same site a year later. So this is the transition period. This is that kind of weedy recovery period I've been talking about. And if you look at this, this is a July photo. Most of the grass that you see in this photo is big bluestem. Big bluestem normally in July is 4, 5, 6 feet tall, blooming, making seed, starting to get ready to produce seed. But in the year after it's been grazed really hard, it doesn't have the energy to do that. And so because it's not as competitive as it normally is above ground and below ground, there's a lot of other plant species that kind of celebrate that and get a chance to really bloom and flourish in a situation that's normally more difficult. So if you know your plants, you can see in here, there's a lot of yarrow, there's rosinweed in the foreground, there's monarda or bee balm, there's purple prairie clover, or white prairie clover, excuse me, blooming, there's hoary vervain. There's a lot of different things happening here, even just, in the photo that you can see. And then right across the burn break, right in the unburned area in the same prairie with no fence in between, this is what the area looks like that hasn't been burned for a couple of years. So this is, like another year further along than that transition period, where the grasses have had time to recover. They've come back. They're nice and tall and thick. There's still quite a few wildflowers here. It's not quite as abundant as it was in that transition period. Here's another photo of that portion of the site that's recovered. It looks fine, right? It looks really nice. But the combination of those three kinds of habitat structure, the short, the transition, and the sort of fully recovered, provides a lot of variety in habitat. So one of the issues with patchburn grazing, though, is that ranchers aren't real fond of it. I don't really envision patchburn grazing becoming something that is widespread across ranches in the Midwest and Great Plains. Part of that is that this relies so much on fire. A lot of ranchers don't have the ability or the need or desire to burn something every year in every pasture. That's a lot of work. And for the Nature Conservancy and on our sites, that's a lot of work. And also, they've probably invested a lot of money in fences, right? Splitting things up into multiple paddocks. And this sort of says, we're going to do away with all that investment, which people are not really happy about. And it's just a weird system. It's not at all what traditional ranching looks like. From an ecological standpoint, I've developed some concerns with this over time, watching it on our sites. And we're using on the scale of, anywhere from, say, 50 acres to 400 acre pastures when we do this. There are a few plant species that I've noticed that even in those unburned areas where cattle are not spending a lot of time, they still will go in there and they'll pick off those plants and often graze them right down to the ground. And those plants can take that for a while. But over time, if that continues to happen and they never get a chance to bloom and reproduce and even store carbohydrates, eventually we're going to lose those plant species. And so we've started, providing ways of allowing them to rest, either doing patchburn grazing for 3 years in a row and then taking a year off, or using electric fence to start fencing out a different area every year and allow these species to bloom and get a rest. But entirely for rosinweed on the left, Canada milkvetch in the middle, and both common and showy milkweed on the right are species that those cows really seek out and will eat regardless of where they are in a patchburn system. So that's something that really caught our attention. We've been trying to figure out how to deal with that. And I want to stop and talk about milkweed and grazing just for a second, because this is a really important topic. And Tim Dixon at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and I have been working on some research the last several years, and we're kind of building into a larger and larger program with this, because I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that cattle eat milkweed, given the latex, the toxic nature of it, the fact that it doesn't taste good. But when you really look in a grazing situation, cattle really like milkweed, especially the common and showy milkweeds that are really important for monarchs. The way that they graze other milkweed species varies by the species, but this is an important thing. And I think there are ways that we can have grazing and milkweed coexist really well. But a lot of times, if you're looking at prairies, in an area where there's a lot of grazing going on, you see a lot of milkweed right outside the fences and not very much inside. So learning how cattle eat how they eat milkweed, how different kinds of grazing systems can affect that is, I think, something that's really going to be important, because there's a lot of rangeland out there that provides, terrific pollination resources and could and can provide a lot of milkweed, but only if it's managed in a certain way. So traditional grazing management a lot of times is in some kind of a rotational system, right? So In this example, this is a deferred rotation system where rancher would put cattle in pasture A for part of the season, and then move them to pasture B for the middle of the season, move them to pasture C in the late part of the season, and leave pasture D ungrazed that year as a way to kind of build roots and biomass for the next year. And then the year after this, they just start in a different place and they do that same kind of rotation. So it's, you have cattle in one place and not the others, and then you move them to the next spot. One of the things that we've tried to do then is we thought, okay, how can we take that approach and combine it with something like patchburn grazing, which creates better habitat structure? Because in a rotational system like this, these rotational systems were really designed to maintain grass dominance. The idea with rotational grazing is you want to move your cattle into an area and then back out before you do too much damage to those grasses and hurt their energy levels and their ability to regrow. And often with this kind of system, you're going to come back to the same pasture. There's other rotational systems where you might graze pasture A 2 or 3 times in one season. And each time you just take a little bit off the top. You let those cows kind of take the tender tips of the grasses and then you move on. And what that does is it ensures that those grasses are always nice and strong. That's a great thing from a cattle production standpoint, potentially. It's not a terrific thing from a pollinator standpoint or from a diversity standpoint, because those dominant grasses are what are suppressing a lot of the plant diversity that other species rely on. So with what we're calling an open gate approach to rotational grazing, we start out in the same way where we allow those cows to graze in pasture A, but we keep them there probably longer than a rancher would, and we let them take that grass pretty short. And then just as it's getting to the point where the cattle are starting to run out of good options to eat, we'll open up the gate to pasture B, but then we'll leave it open. And what that does is it lets those cows flow back and forth between those first 2 pastures. They can keep grazing the regrowth in pasture A, which is really attractive because it's just like something that's been burned. That fresh regrowth, that new shoot coming up off the base of the plant, is incredibly nutritious to cattle. And even if it's not very tall, they really seek that out. But it also gives them options so they can move over into a new area and eat other plants if they need to. So they can regulate their diet any way they want to. And as the season goes on, and again, I'm showing you a 4-pasture example. You can do this with whatever number of pastures you have. Basically, anytime you feel like the cows are starting to run out of options or run short on grass, you just open up another gate like a pressure relief valve, and you let those cows flow into an additional area. And over time, what you end up with here is you end up with pasture A being grazed really intensively for the entire year. They start on it early, and then because they started on it and there's regrowth there, they're attracted to it. They keep coming back. You've got pasture B, which doesn't get grazed right away in the season, but then it gets grazed pretty hard for the rest of the year. You've got pasture C, which gets grazed right at the end of the season. In this case, usually after the point at which those grasses have sort of done their flowering and all the important work for the year. So the grazing might affect the habitat structure, but doesn't really affect the vigor of most of those grasses and other wildflowers, except maybe the real late season stuff. And you've got pasture D, which hasn't been grazed at all. And that's usually the one that was, grazed in the most intensively the previous year. And in this system, you can still use fire if fire is an important part of your management, either for woody plant control or for other reasons. There are still going to be patches of that open gate system you can use fire, but it doesn't rely on it. And here's what it can look like in the pasture that's getting grazed all season. And a lot of people would look at this, both ranchers and biologists would look at this maybe and say, wow, that's being overgrazed. That doesn't look good at all. But there are a lot of species that rely on this kind of habitat, both plants and animals. And the next year, this is what that same site looks like in its transition period. So in this case, at this particular site, which is actually my family prairie, you've got a lot of western ragweed, you've got some native thistles, you've got silverleaf scurf pea and stiff sunflower and stiff goldenrod in the background there getting ready to bloom. There's a lot of diversity, but the grasses are very short. This, instead of big blue stem and Indian grass, again, being 4 or 5 feet tall, you can see one flowering stalk of big blue stem in the foreground, but even that plant, its leaves are very short because it had a pretty rough year the year before with grazing. Here's another example in more of a lowland site where ironweed and hoary vervain are having a terrific year. And if you want to talk about butterfly plants, it's hard to beat those two in our landscape. And then later in the season, you've got a lot of stiff goldenrod and in this case, dotted gayfeather, which is not really responding to the grazing so much, although it does usually put on more stems, flowering stems after grazing. And then if you look at all 4 pastures together, here's what you get. across a 4-pasture example of open gate grazing. So the top left is the pasture that's been grazed hard all season. And these are August photos, late August photos. The top right is the one that the cows moved into second. So they've grazed that pretty short, but there's a lot more thatch and kind of structure out there. And so you can have very different habitat structure, even within those two fairly similar habitats for different animals, and plants will respond differently. Number 3, bottom left there, is the recovery patch. That's that transition patch. That's what paddock number 1 will look like a year from now. And then you've got paddock 4, which the cows didn't come into until after I took these pictures in late August, where the grass is really tall and rank. Your perennial flowers are all blooming well. There's been no disturbance there for almost 2 years now at this point. So it's tall and thick. So again, that combination is really important. And compared to patchburn grazing, I think there's some advantages here in that it doesn't require fire. It uses infrastructure that ranchers probably already have. It's still weird, especially the fact that you're getting the cattle to graze that short. That makes ranchers uncomfortable, as well as a lot of biologists. And it gives us a way to provide rest for some of those plant species like rosinweed or milk vetch or milkweed that are getting grazed continually in a patchburn system. And then, of course, you've got this discussion about this level of intensive grazing, and I get it. People get concerned about the cows, but in the open gate system, the cows are choosing to do this, right? The cows that are grazing in this picture have other pastures available to them where the grass is taller. They're grazing here because they want to. This is where they're coming for that high quality vegetation. And these cows are in really good shape condition wise. And then the second worry is that, well, if you graze this hard for that long, these plant species aren't going to recover. Well, we've got a lot of data that shows the opposite there. This is some data from a couple of restored prairies where we've done not open gate, but patchburn grazing for a lot of years. And you can see on the left, these sites were planted in 2000 on the top and 2002. So you sort of see an increase in plant species diversity. This is actually species richness of plants at a square meter scale. But then it kind of levels off and it hasn't changed. We've been patch burning both of these sites since about 2009. And so they've been consistently maintaining that species diversity. And then if you look at individual species, and I've provided 2 examples here, stiff sunflower on the top and purple prairie clover on the bottom, they're doing fine. Their populations are remaining steady in the grazed area. In fact, the purple prairie clover is doing much better in the grazed area than in an ungrazed area that we used as kind of a control. So again, I'm not advocating these as specific approaches. I'm providing these as examples of ways to create that shifting mosaic. And there are lots of other ways to do this. I'm hoping that people will be inspired by this to try their own examples and come up with ways to do this that make sense for them in their own situation. The key points are to try to provide some way of creating a diversity of these habitat structures, creating some contrast from place to place, so that you end up with something that looks like this from the air, where you've got some areas that are short, some areas that are very tall, and then some areas that are sort of in the middle or recovering from that intensive grazing, and providing across this, this is a 200-acre prairie here. Across that 200-acre prairie, there's a lot of options for wildlife, and there's a lot of different growing conditions being provided for plants year to year. And then each of these shifts to a different place the next year. Okay, so at the end here, I want to talk about what if you don't have grazing as an option? How can you provide that kind of same habitat heterogeneity and help increase your plant diversity for pollinators and everything else? One of the problems with small prairies is that they're small. And if you have any options, of course, to do restoration work to make those prairies bigger, everything gets easier. It makes the populations of everything living in those small prairies a lot more viable, a lot more likely to survive in the long term, because they can have their population be larger. They can be connected to other small populations in the same prairie. That's always going to be the best option, but it's not always a feasible thing. So if you can't, and if you have fire available to you, a couple of things are really important. One is don't burn the entire prairie, right? If you have a prairie that's, say, 20 acres surrounded by cornfield, you don't want to burn that whole 20 acres in the same year, because whatever time you burn, you're going to be wiping out some species that are there, whether it's in a dormant season, you've got insects that are overwintering in the thatch or in the above ground dead stems of last year's plants, or burning in the late spring when some things are active, or in the summer when things are active. Any timing of fire is going to hurt some particular group of species. And so it's really important to leave refuges out there where you don't burn the entire patch, maybe burn a half, 2/3 at the most. And then try that at different seasons and at different intensities. You can vary the intensity of a fire by picking days with different kinds of humidity, wind speeds, temperatures, and you can create a burn that's much more patchy instead of just a uniform black at the end. And then you can do the same thing with haying or mowing, whatever option you're using, right? Leave some refuges. Don't mow the whole thing at once. Think about it from a bee's perspective. If you're a solitary bee living in a nest in a hole in the ground in the middle of a prairie, you might have a circle of access from that hole where you fly out, and you have a limited flight distance. So maybe 100 yards in every direction. So if you've got a 20-acre prairie and you've got bees nesting out in the middle of that, and that entire 20-acre prairie gets hayed in the same day, all of a sudden the bees that are living in that prairie have nothing, right? All of their resources just went away, and your entire universe basically disappears, and that nest is going to fail. So leaving some refuges out there where there are still some pollinator plants, but also just some habitat structure for other things is really important. When you cut hay or when you mow, anything you can do to vary the timing from year to year, and also the height. So you don't always mow it really short. Sometimes you mow it a little higher, a little shorter. Some places, maybe you want to mow the same place multiple times in one year and create sort of like that, the grazing pressure we were talking about earlier. And other areas, don't get burnt or don't get mowed at all for a year or two, and let them recover from that. And you don't have to use straight lines, right? You don't have to divide it into halves. You can make zigzags. You can go out in the middle of a thick area and mow some small patches out in the middle of it. Create some heterogeneity of habitat any way you can come up with doing it. And create that shifting mosaic like we've got here. And the last thing with small prairies, of course, is the smaller the prairie, the more likely it is that brush and other invasives are going to be a major threat, because they're coming in from those edges. And the less area that's further away, that's far away from edges, the more pressure there's going to be throughout the whole prairie. And there's just not a lot you can do about that other than to stay on top of invasives. And that's not really the point of this talk. It's just a reality of small prairies. So I want to wrap up. Just to reiterate the importance of both plant diversity and pollinator diversity, and the fact that they rely on each other. And then the fact that if you really want resilient prairies with a lot of both animal and plant diversity, habitat heterogeneity becomes important. So managing that structure, creating a shifting mosaic, is going to help foster that species diversity and the resilience that's going to help us get these prairies through the next 50 or 100 years. So that's it for me. This is my page of plugs. If you're interested in this stuff, I write a blog where I post usually twice a week on everything from management and restoration to just prairie photos. I've got a book I wrote on prairie management, and then I recently did a project where I looked at 1 square meter of prairie and photographed it over an entire year, just to kind of show people the diversity of life that you can find in a small patch of prairie. So with that, if there's time to talk about questions, we can do that now, or whatever you want to do, Lori.
Yeah, that'd be great, Chris. We have some questions, a lot relating to grazing, which I think you know a little bit about.
Sure.
So the first question are, can you talk about the different types of grazers? This is kind of combining a few questions into one. It seems like, for instance, if they're not that horses are grazers, but someone has horses and they found that there are a lot of unwanted weeds in and around a campground near the horses, and would goats or cattle or buffalo be different?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can divide those animals into basically 2 groups to start with. So you've got horses, cattle, and bison. And horses, cattle, and bison are all grass feeders first. They all select for grasses mostly. They'll eat other things, but they really want grass as the bulk of their diet, where cattle and sheep are the other side. They're going to mostly choose broadleaf plants as their primary diet. They'll eat grasses if they have to. And that's really different, right? So if you're trying to manage for plant diversity, wildflowers make up the bulk of that plant diversity. Of course, if you want pollinators, you want a lot of you want a lot of wildflowers. So sheep and goats are going to work against that, at least in the short term, because they're going to be feeding on those plants that you're trying to foster. Where cattle, horses, and bison are all eating the grasses, which are competing with those wildflowers, which is advantageous, at least from my point of view. Bison and cattle are awfully similar if you allow them the space to roam around and choose their own diets. There's some research that shows some diet differences between them, but usually that research is done in a way where cattle are forced into these little rotational pastures where they kind of have to eat what's in front of them, and bison are allowed to roam across 1,000 acres. And of course, they're going to be grazing differently because they're in different situations. When you treat them the same way, bison and cattle are pretty similar. Bison might be still a little bit more selective toward grasses and eat slightly less wildflowers, or slightly fewer wildflowers to speak well. But they're overall they're pretty similar. There's some behavioral differences that are important. Cattle like to stand around in water and under trees a lot more than bison do. But bison also don't work as well in a small area, and cattle can be a lot more effective in a smaller pasture, like 100 acres or 30 acres or whatever. Horses are interesting because they've got the same diet. They graze a little bit differently, but they eat a very similar diet. But usually when you see horses, they're in a very small pasture, kind of along somebody's house, on an acreage or something, where they don't have enough space to survive on the plants that are there. So they're being fed hay, and then they just eat whatever else they can. And so a lot of those horse pastures look like golf courses or putting greens, but it's not the horse's fault. It's the situation. Where I've seen and talked to people who have grazed horses on a large scale, they can respond the same way the cattle and bison, and within a Patchburn graze system, for example, they can be really effective at providing that diversity. And then on sheep and goats, I'm not saying that sheep and goats are bad. What I'm saying is that as a perennial grazer, where you just sort of let them do what they want to do, they're gonna choose to eat a lot of the plants that a lot of us, I think on this call, think are really important for pollinators and other species. And so you have to just know what that is and use them effectively. If that's the species that you have, just know that they're going to be eating those pollinator plants.
Okay, great. Here's the next one for you, Chris. And you might have to explain a little bit about this question to start with for those that need. Can you talk about the economics involved with ranchers and implementing the open gate rotation or other systems? How do you make it more viable for both the ranchers and the plant community?
Sure. So with ranchers and economics, the biggest thing that most ranchers are going to be thinking about is their stocking rate. How many animals do they have? They also are going to think about how they're going to market those animals. Are they selling calves? Are they raising yearlings? Are they doing a cow calf where the job is to produce more calves every year to sell off? So that marketing influences a lot of it, but stocking rate is really the big thing. And the nice thing about Patchburn grazing or an open gate system is that it doesn't require any kind of a different stocking rate than the system that those ranchers are probably already using. If those ranchers have a reasonable stocking rate in whatever approach they're taking, they wouldn't have to change the stocking rate. So from an economic standpoint, from a pure economic standpoint, there shouldn't be any difference. The biggest difference is the cultural shift, or the sort of the weirdness of it, or the peer pressure. And that's probably more important than economics for most ranchers. Ranchers know each other. They look across the fences. They're small, tight-knit communities. And so it's really difficult for somebody to do something vastly different than all their neighbors, even if it might make them more money. That peer pressure is super important, just like it is for all of us, right? There's no difference there. And so a lot of what is done on a ranch or a farm or anything else is as much about tradition and culture and what the family has always done and what the neighbors think is acceptable, than it is about economics. Pure economics is not usually the major driver in a lot of that. So I think to sort of get to what the question I think is really aiming at, I think the key here is, if we want to encourage more and more, diversity fostering management approaches for ranchers or farmers that are grazing prairies, it's going to be as much about changing the culture and changing the vision of what a well-managed pasture looks like as it is about economics. And that's just something that, A, it's going to take some time. B, it's going to take, reaching some of the sort of the idea leaders, the vision leaders in those communities, and bringing them along with us. And it's going to probably take some more research into, if you've got cattle that mostly eat grass, why do you care about black-eyed Susans or Maximilian sunflowers or purple prairie clover or those other species? What benefit does that give you as a rancher? And there's kind of economic reasons to think about that are very direct. And then there's the indirect stuff, like maybe it's just better to live in a landscape that looks better. feels good to do the work for pollinators. It's much better wildlife habitat. All those other things are also important. But the key there is, I think it's really the cultural, the social pressure that's going to be as important as the finances.
Chris, can you take 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. How does drought and/or climate change affect the patchburn grazing method, especially with the well-grazed section in terms of erosion and possibly loss of ability for the plants to bounce back if that section was hit with several years of drought after being grazed short?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important question, right? Um, I think we're still learning on that. With patchburn grazing, it's been done enough now that we feel pretty good. It's been done in Western Oklahoma and Eastern Colorado and Utah and places where they have a lot of drought all the time. And the key there is, as with any other grazing system, you build drought into your stocking rates, right? So you don't stock based on good years, you stock based on bad years. And as long as you're doing that, you're always going to be grazing and resting the right number of acres of prairie. So patchburn grazing really isn't any different there. In fact, both patchburn grazing and open gate grazing have some potential big advantages during the drought, because when a drought hits, the way a rancher or farmer is going to respond is, if they're prepared for a drought, if they have a drought management plan, right, they're going to have these trigger points at which, okay, if the rainfall up to this point is less than average, I know that I need to start pulling some animals off, because if I don't, I'm not going to have enough grass a month from now. With these systems, you actually have a little bit more flexibility, that if you have a dry spring or a dry early summer, but you get rains later in the year, you might be able to keep those animals in there a little longer, because you can open the next gate sooner. Or in a patch burn system, those cows have those ungrazed areas, those unburned areas they can move into if they need to. And it gives you a little bit extra buffer in terms of your decision-making process. So that from the cattle management standpoint, I think there's some advantages potentially there. And then from just like an ecological standpoint, you're right, a drought is going to slow down recovery. But the key point in designing any of these approaches is you want to make sure that they're designed so that they have the time to do that. So for example, in an open gate system, you want to make sure that you're setting up so that if it takes 3 years instead of 2 years for it to fully recover, you're not rushing into that pasture 2 years later to graze it. And the more pastures you have, the more flexibility you have in some ways with that. But I've also been really surprised watching my own family prairie over the last, 12 years now that we've been using this open gate approach. We've gone through some severe droughts, including 2012, which was, one of the most, I think it is the most severe single year drought in Nebraska's history. And we didn't have to pull animals out that year early. We kept them in there and we just let them spread out. We bumped the stocking rate back the next year, 20% or 15%, whatever that was. And we just kept moving, and those sites recovered really nicely. So we still have a lot to learn about it, but I don't think it's any worse than anything else. We've not seen any erosion issues. As long as we don't graze those sites more than 1 year, that intense grazing for a single year doesn't really cause us erosion problems. It might if you were in a more steep landscape with real lush soils, something like that. I can see some concerns there, but at least in the areas I'm at, we haven't had trouble yet.
Okay. Boy, we have some good questions here. This one's on burning. What are the optimal times of year conditions for burning? And can you talk a little bit about other species that might be out in the prairie or the landscape that you're burning, and to avoid those like pollinators or birds?
Yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, there's no time that you can burn that's safe for everything, right? Um, and so I think, again, the key is to just make sure that you're not burning a large enough percentage of whatever prairie you're in that you're going to wipe out an entire population of the species. During the winter time, like I said, you've got a lot of invertebrates that are overwintering, and other animals that are overwintering in the thatch or in the above ground vegetation. And so a fire that comes through during the dormant season is going to hit all of those. When the growing season starts and things that were underground or overwintering that thatch start to become active again, any kind of burn there is going to have an impact on them. At least they're mobile, and a lot of them can potentially get out of the way. And then the same thing, of course, is true during the later parts of the year, summer or fall. So it doesn't make fire good or bad. It just, I mean, and again, fire has been a key process in prairies for as long as these prairies have been around. It just comes back to managing it properly, right? Don't burn. There's no right time to burn, just as there's no wrong time to burn. You have to look at your objectives. What are you trying to do with that burn? Don't burn just because you think fire is good. Have a specific objective for what you're trying to accomplish, and that'll dictate the time of year that you need to burn. But then just try to do a burn at a different time of year each time if you can. Shift the season around a little bit. Again, burn on a day with a little more humidity, so you end up with a little bit of a patchier burn where some places don't burn as much as others. And just leave plenty of places that are unburned nearby, so that you have, if you do kill some species in one area, they can recolonize from those nearby refuges.
Thank you, Chris. We have one more question.
Okay.
Have you encountered incorporating any rotational small-scale organic food production into land prairie management, either in your own experience or in your professional experience?
If you're talking about like cultivating plants, no, I have not. But in terms of, like products that can come from a prairie, there's plenty of options for seed production, or flower production, or other things that people might be able to, harvest and sell, or harvest and use themselves. But no, in terms of food production specifically, I haven't really seen any of that. Not that it couldn't be done. It's just not something I have experience with.
Yes, well, I imagine farmers are doing it all the time.
Sure.
Well, I think that's it for questions. Those were really, it's really a great talk, and as usual, your photography is amazing. As I said to Heather Home, you might be having to do some photography classes, or are you already doing that?
Yeah, I do some now and then. Yeah, Heather's fantastic. I enjoy looking at her photos too.
Well, thank you, Chris. And I hope you can, it sounds like you have some more presentations to do today. So we'll
Yep, I got to
let you
run.
get on to it. Thank
All
you
right.
very much.
Yep, thanks everybody.
Next.